Greetings, my fellow tryhards. It's time to talk about Kingdom Hearts 3. I did so a while back after the game first released in my first impressions video, maybe you've seen it, and I recommend you watch that before continuing for a rundown of my thoughts on the core game, and to get context for what we'll be talking about here. Because, as I said at the time, this is not meant to be taken as the definitive, climactic, 100% explored every facet of Kingdom Hearts 3 video. That will come later. And later is now. It's been just over 2 years since then, and both I and the game have had the time we needed to stew, for the game to arrive at its final completed state with patches and DLC, and for me to grow a brain, a dick, and a heart, and play them. And while I haven't 100%ed the game, I have explored every aspect of it I cared to. I wasn't going to play all those gummy missions. And as you can see, I've become the keeper of the Keyblade. What are your credentials? Now, at last, I can give you my comprehensive thoughts on the completed version of this landmark installment in the series, as well as updates on what we've learned in the interim about the future of Kingdom Hearts. So forget that veiny old man and his silly old plans, and his creepy weird hands, because no longer will Kingdom Hearts discussion on this channel be
a far-off memory that's like a scattered dream.
Haha! I remember when the story was good. Now first things first, we've got a lot of info to cover, so feel free to use the time codes below to skip around if there was a particular section you're interested in, be it in the additional story from the DLC, the Superbosses, the future of the series, etc. But otherwise, just relax, listen to that smooth jazz, and let me take you on a guided tour of everything Kingdom Hearts 3. Now this here game released in its original form on January 25th, 2019, with its lone DLC, Remind, releasing January 23rd, 2020, just under a year later. However, not all the changes to the game we've seen since its release were located solely in the DLC, as there were a number of update patches that added to or modified aspects of the original game, the last of which came in February 2020. The Remind trailers showed this helpful image here, containing a quick rundown of the new content that was released with the DLC, both for the DLC and the base game. We'll refer back to this when discussing what's new, and I'll keep you up to speed on the stuff it doesn't list. So if you're someone like me who didn't come back to the game for a while since it first came out, if you're wondering if the game is worth playing again even if you don't want to shell out the 30 extra bucks for the DLC, the answer might well be yes, just for the new abilities, keyblades, and difficulty mode, especially if you have the wisdom to, like me, skip all the cutscenes. Once was enough for this bullshit. So, just what are these updates? The first free item on the list is a main story update. What does this consist of, you ask? Well, some people thought it might mean that new cutscenes would be added to flesh out more aspects of the plot, like the extra cutscenes added to Kingdom Hearts 2 Final Mix. In actuality, there's none of that, as Nomura is quite insistent that the base game stands alone, with Remind being separate, sequential content. It actually refers to several modified cutscenes from the end of the game with redone lighting, effects, music, and animations, apparently to leave things off on a less dour tone and make the characters seem happier. Like my man Riku here, who is just chipper as pie to watch his friend Sora die. Why weren't things like this from the beginning? I guess Nomura changed his mind about the tone later. But we're just getting started with retcon talk, so all this is a drop in the bucket. Let's skip the abilities discussion for a moment and talk about our lovely new Keyblades, the Oathkeeper and the Oblivion. Now, everybody knows these are fan-favorite Keyblades that represent Sora's connection to Kairi, Riku, and, in combination, Roxas, so it's nice to see them back. Personally, as soon as I got them, I almost completely stopped using every other Keyblade, except of course for the Ultima weapon, cause fuck all the Disney ones. But I wouldn't say I love everything about their inclusion. So to unlock the Oathkeeper, you have to snap pictures of all 90 lucky emblems in the game. And to get the Oblivion, best Keyblade 19 years strong, you have to beat the game on critical mode. You may notice about both of these that they are definitely in the category of Endgame Content. And while I don't have a problem with them as extra content in of itself, it does serve as a continuation of the absolute worst trait of Kingdom Hearts 3, something that has only deepened the more content that's been added. It's that, unless you really love you some Disney, the first 20 to 30 hours of the game are comparatively dog shit in a variety of ways. While almost everything good or even plot relevant begins directly after you beat the last Disney World in one giant chunk at the end of the game. This is a generalization, as there are fun gameplay segments in the Disney Worlds, for example, but overall it is a common feeling that pervades the reaction to the game. And this is a much discussed habit of the series that has worsened the more games have been released. Kingdom Hearts 1, of course, did the best job in mixing the original Kingdom Hearts plot and lore with the Disney backdrop as you explore and search for your lost friends, making you feel like a meaningful participant in the worlds you visit and leaving an impact on Sora. With Kingdom Hearts 2 doing much worse at this, with most worlds Sora visits feeling like arbitrary time wasters that just retread movie events verbatim. Although at least some context was supplied to give purpose to the struggles the organization put Sora through. Finally, this culminated in Kingdom Hearts 3, where the de facto two sides of the game, Disney and Kingdom Hearts, almost completely failed to intersect whatsoever, leading to the famously terrible pacing of the game. We'll talk more about the absence of Final Fantasy and what's been added back in the DLC later. There is speculation this is due to the Disney overlords being too overbearing as to what the development team was allowed to do with the story, and that this is why the Pixar worlds of Toy Story and Monsters, Inc. have much better story elements, because they were allowed to stray from the original script more and get creative. But I'm not here to tell you about Jesus or dive into the heart to explain what was going on at the studio and who's to blame. I'm here to tell you that this sucked balls. This has implications for things like the inclusion of the Oathkeeper and Oblivion Keyblades, because instead of including some story moments between characters and giving Sora relevant Keyblades that might have some personal or thematic importance beyond the mandatory Disney ones, you know, like we did in the other games, we instead just tack them on as endgame content. I don't think it's nitpicky to say that rubs me the wrong way. Looking back, it's rather disappointing just how few Keyblades there are in this game. Yes, they are over the minimum, with one for every Disney world, the character-specific necessities, the Ultima weapon, and even a few related to minigames. But there's a real lack of the kind of Bond representation Keyblades we've seen before. Hey look, there's some of them in the Keyblade graveyard. There's the Fenrir and the Sleeping Lion. Quite a few of them, actually. Can I just hop over there and grab one of the... No? Well... Okay. I remind you, this is a video game, not a movie. So it's through being given gameplay tools to horse around with that have some thematic or symbolic meaning, like the Oathkeeper and Oblivion, that can help you as a player to appreciate those aspects of the game more. I understand it's more challenging to add Keyblades in this game with the addition of form changes, so that every new Keyblade takes that much more development time to implement, although we do have plenty of duplicated form change gameplay styles. But giving a new Keyblade or two to represent the bonds of all the characters you save and reunite with in this game, in keeping with what the series has done many times before, would go a long way. This wouldn't be the first time an update to one of these games added something like that. Remember the old Roxas-themed 2-become-1 Keyblade you got after beating Roxas in KH2? That was a thematically rich Keyblade added in Final Mix, and it's the kind of thing they could have added here. Or could they? Because this is what I'm talking about with the Oathkeeper and Oblivion. Ideally, it would have been nice to get those Keyblades at some appropriate story point in the game. But what did we say before? There is no point in the game where you even interact with Riku and Kairi until the endgame begins in the mad 7-hour bum rush to the finish line. The fundamental design of the game precluded the option to create those kinds of gameplay narrative intersectional moments that really make an impact. And that's the real shame here. And if I wanted to nitpick a tad more, I could talk about how both these Keyblade form changes are functionally identical. And while I appreciate how they recreate full power Roxas's combat style, with a bunch of stylish particle effects and dual wielding, they even recreated the little laser blast when you steal the Keyblades. That's beautiful. Still, I was a little disappointed the Keyblades don't actually transform like the other ones for both levels. I was hoping for some kind of edgy darkness, sword, scythe transformation for the Oblivion personally. You know, something original building on what we already loved. Not just more references and nostalgia baiting of past events that are more memorable than what this game has. Though don't get me wrong, I love me a good
dual wield.
Now, getting back to our list, the next new feature is expanded sharing features. Square Enix have been real assholes in regulating streaming and recording the game, presumably to avoid leaking the secret content, and this seems to be them relaxing that regulation in some way, though not eliminating it. I know my PS4 recording cut out when I got to the final cutscene after the secret boss, but oh thank you for the privilege, merciful gods! Also, this obnoxious border is still present for all the PS4 recordings done with the system's internal recorder, so thanks for that, Square Enix. Next up is a feature not on the list here as it was released with an earlier update, but the addition of Critical Mode, the traditional highest difficulty setting for the series, was a crucial new addition to the game, and it's no exaggeration to say that it alone changed my experience of the bulk of combat from mind-numbingly tedious to actually fun. The reason being that the game now actually provides a challenge. The next difficulty difficulty level down, Proud Mode, is a massive jump down in difficulty, and I don't recommend ever playing on it to veterans or even players generally familiar with this style of gameplay. While Critical Mode might be a bit much for first-time players, it is absolutely the way the game is meant to be played, limiting your HP and MP, access to situation commands, and ramping up enemy AI, which forces you to learn more of the mechanics of combat in order to stay alive, not just brute forcing your way through the game, mashing X as is all too easy on lower difficulties. Truly beyond the X button. The game also gives you more abilities earlier from the start of the game to handle the higher difficulty, so players also have a chance to enjoy more fleshed out combat sooner, which is always appreciated. There are unique new abilities to Critical Mode as well that complement high level play, namely Critical Counter that gives additional damage to counters after well-timed blocks, Critical Recharge that fills the situation command gauge more quickly while recharging MP, and my personal favorite, Critical Converter, which removes the attraction flow option from normal combat in exchange for more form change commands. Yes, you heard that right. This ability disables attractions completely. I guess they heard us complain about them because they're just admitting those were a terrible mechanic by giving us the option to turn it off. And honestly, God bless them for it. Now, I couldn't complete a discussion of Critical Mode without mentioning one specific moment in the game that really stands out from it. As I mentioned, Critical Mode cuts your HP significantly, and that's including for some of the minigames we are forced to put up with in a normal playthrough. And the one that is seared into my brain like a nightmare is the Frozen Slider event, where you have to ride your shield and avoid attacks from these Ice Dragon Heartless. Of course, this is one of those minigames with a totally new control scheme you are expected to learn on the fly, so normally you can get hit a few times and brute force your way through. But on Critical Mode, you can only take 2 or 3 hits total before dying and having to restart. I personally had to replay this part dozens upon dozens of times for hours until I finally made it through on sheer luck. Now, I'm not the best at video games, but it feels like this event was not tested for this game difficulty at all. I've seen some people say they had no trouble avoiding all hits in this minigame, and that's great for you. But I know I'm not alone in my pain here. I don't mean to go on too much about this, but I suffered for this, so you get to hear about it. Aside from that, Critical Mode is all gravy, and if you don't play on it, you are little baby. Now, for the last of the free updates, let's talk about those new abilities. Specifically, these 6 new combat abilities that update Sora's moveset. Let's quickly run through what they do. It's gonna get a little technical here, but bear with me. Quick Slash is a fast attack that activates at the start of a combo and immediately hits nearby enemies. Flash Step is a mid-range attack that charges the enemy while blocking. Radial Blaster is an AoE attack that launches projectiles in all directions. Aerial Sweep is a long-range spinning gap closer that launches Sora upward at enemies, while Aerial Dive does the same, just sending Sora downward. And Last Charge is a new finishing move that blasts enemies with a large magic burst. What you need to know about these moves is that they straight up replace many of the moves from Sora's basic Keyblade combo, and have vastly improved the feel of combat. One of the updates also added the ability to dodge cancel more easily out of your combos, so that, in addition to the faster startups and reduced end lag of these moves, has given players much more freedom and precise control over Sora's moveset. It seems likely that they were implemented to directly address complaints about Kingdom Hearts 3's slower, clunkier combo that we often called floaty. One change that's emblematic of this update is what was done to the final combo finisher. The original was this move, Magic Flash, which initially had this pathetic animation, along with an excessively long startup period and end lag, although it was later upgraded with a slightly better animation. Even with that, it still lacks impact and is incredibly unsatisfying to use, especially compared to classics like Explosion from KH2. Well, it looks like the devs realized this move sucks as well, because the new finisher, Last Charge, finally gives us a finisher that has some damn hair on its chest and executes faster than the speed at which old people fuck. Upon equipping it, it also directly overrides Magic Flash, even if you have both equipped, so you're likely to never see the move again, which again seems like a clear admission that they are happy to toss it down the memory hole, and that suits me just fine. About Aerial Sweep and Aerial Dive, the mobility given by these moves gives Sora a vastly greater ability to home in on enemies wherever they may be while attacking. But depending on your gameplay style, the convenience introduced by this is slightly more of a double-edged sword. See, in KH1, KH2, and base KH3, Sora didn't have the long-distance gap-closing homing attacks these function as, and thus gameplay required you to do more manual locating and approaching of enemies. Only once within the relatively small striking distance would it make sense to begin attacking. These moves change that formulation and allow you to be more spam-happy with your Keyblade attacks, especially if you know an enemy is going to be vulnerable to a hit at a certain time, but not knowing exactly where they will appear, something extremely useful in the small enclosed areas of the DLC Superboss fights. To sum this up, there's something of a trade-off, as the very large attack range given by these abilities, in combination with the lock-on mechanic, somewhat undercuts the requirement for players to develop spatial awareness in combat, allowing players to do less thinking and more spamming attacks, aerial recoveries, and reprisals. Not to mention how they are somewhat redundant with the air step mechanic, the ultimate gap-closing tool usable from almost any distance, though one that still requires the player to locate and focus down enemies, that I have grown more and more fond of the more I've played. Basically, I can see an appeal to playing without them for the additional challenge it provides, something the DLC is largely about. Now, there were actually a few conflicting theories circulating about how and when these abilities get unlocked, so I went in and did some testing. First of all, you do not start a fresh save file with these abilities, not even on critical mode, and they are only unlocked upon beating the game, so they won't do any good for you on your first playthrough, which really sucks. After you clear the game, however, when you start a new game, you will now have the option to carry over elements from a game-cleared save. The menu that pops up tells you that what carries over is just the Keyblades and selfie poses from that data, but I was able to confirm that you also get these 6 new abilities that you'll have for the start of the game, regardless of the difficulty setting for both the clear data and the new game. The fact that abilities aren't listed here definitely led to some confusion and wild theories, when really it was all very simple. You just gotta inherit from cleared data. So thanks for that, guys. So again, too bad about that first playthrough, but even there, at least you'll have these abilities for the DLC. And let's be honest, that's where they really matter. Now, before we dig into the DLC, let's talk about all that juicy endgame content I hadn't explored in my first video. Perhaps this is obvious to you, but when it comes to JRPG-style games that feature a lot of ability unlocking as you progress, I've long felt that these type of games are typically at their best in the endgame. When you've gotten through most of the main scenario and unlocked the majority of the powers, worlds, and ability to explore, the game can finally flex all the mechanics to their utmost potential and really stretch the limits of the game, not having any more artificial restraints imposed upon you, and finally presenting the player with challenges that require higher level mastery than just blundering through to reach the end credits. It's a matter of taste and execution, but as long as that, for lack of a better term, growth period is done well, I typically don't mind it. But it's in the endgame where the mechanics of these games can really start to shine, and this is certainly the case with Kingdom Hearts. KH2FM famously did this with its added content, the Cavern of Remembrance, the 13 Mushrooms, and of course, the Data Organization and Lingering Will boss fights. I will be trying not to lean too much on comparisons to that game when it comes to the quality of KH3, particularly before the DLC release, but some degree of it is warranted, plus it's basically my favorite game of all time, so these things happen. So in addition to tolerating the slow release of abilities over the course of a game, I'm a weirdo who specifically enjoys grinding as a kind of relaxing, meditative experience, so I never particularly minded things like grinding out drive form levels in KH2. Although don't get me wrong, the game would be much improved if the form abilities were unlocked in some coherent, progressive way, as they do in KH1. But on that point, when it comes to endgame exploration beyond just racking up EXP, I like being incentivized to explore less prominent features of the game and even the gimmicky minigames, as long as they aren't terribly designed, to get rare rewards. It feels like the game is squeezing its mechanics to get more juice out of them. Not to mention I have to voluntarily choose to do them instead of being railroaded into it as you are in the main campaign, which makes a big difference in the mind of the player that is far more likely to have them enjoy the experience. So in short, these endgame activities were by far the most fun I had before the DLC. The first of them was to collect the series staple 13 secret reports that contain additional information and lore. They can be collected, you guessed it, after you beat the main story, by challenging 13 battle gates scattered among the worlds that have you tackling various collections of enemies from throughout the game. They're a decent enough challenge for those looking to test their skills at that point in the game, but as for the reports themselves, well, here's where we've got to start asking the question. Do you still care about the lore of these games? The reports are from a number of character perspectives, relating to a few topics, including Subject X, the mysterious girl Axel and Sykes befriended that led to their path of joining Ansem and later the organization, giving more insight into Sykes' current plans, Subject X's involvement as a test subject of Xehanort, and her likely connection to the ancient Keyblade wielders of mobile game fame. By the way, I'm going to be using nobody names for all the organization members, even if some of them have been restored to their somebody forms, because it doesn't matter and I don't care. We get more insight into Vexen and Zexion's plans to restore Roxas and the other strugglers through the use of replicas. And finally, we get more insight from Xigbar, aka Lushu, on his personal history, his involvement with the Lost Masters and the Master of Masters, the plan for their return, and generally setting up the plot of Kingdom Hearts 4. And for the record, nothing contained in there makes Xigbar's reveal as Lushu feel less jarring. He was a character kept just mysterious enough to leave Nomura space to fill in whatever lore his J-pop-addled mind required for the plot, leading to where we are now. As someone who's played multiple versions of every single game in the series, hunting for scraps of lore up until the release of KH3, once the plot of the mobile game became essential to an understanding of the series, on top of all the other mandatory spin-off games, my 2 remaining brain cells finally sparked, leading to the determination that analyzing this shit is no longer worth my time. And I won't hear this argument that it's pointless to say this because the writing of Kingdom Hearts was never good. Cliché, tropey, simplistic, then needlessly complex, and filled with anime bullshit? Sure. But welcome to JRPGs. We're not writing Shakespeare here. None of that is a death sentence, maybe even a benefit, as long as the core of the story is solid and the game is still fun. It's only when you see the internal logic they expect you to pay attention to start to seriously self-contradict that the narrative justifiably loses credibility. Plus, the secret reports specifically were much better integrated into the other games. With information doled out throughout the game, I couldn't wait to read, whereas now they feel more like an obligation tacked on at the end. It's a Kingdom Hearts game, right? We gotta have 13 secret reports. The point being that many of us have been through the ringer with this series and put up with a lot of bullshit. And if you, like me, have reached your limit, I want you to know it's okay. I absolve you of your guilt. I know what I'm talking about here.
Really, I'm the type of guy who scrutinized and theorized about how, for Lingering Will and the other good guys in the KH2 secret movie, their Keyblades didn't have keychains on the end of them. Ooh, what does this mean? What does this imply about Keyblade lore? Well, the answer was nothing, because they just went on to retcon the keychains back in Birth by Sleep. So, lesson learned, no more of that shit.
Or how about that old recusant sigil thing, where apparently having an X on your clothes is a really big deal and highly plot relevant? Good thing our characters never had X's on them before, that'd be embarrassing. Or, this is the last one I swear, remember all those rules that used to exist about how only having multiple hearts in you let you use multiple Keyblades? So having Ventus's heart in Sora and Roxas is what let them dual wield. Not to mention using the same one at the same time like with Xion as well. That was kind of a big deal back then. Remember that? But if Ventus is back and his heart is no longer in Sora, then how are they all still doing that? The answer is who cares? What were we talking about again? Oh right, the important lore of the secret reports. I leave the specific details of these reports to each of you to judge for yourselves, but to me, they were largely redundant, uninteresting, and lazily implemented. Moving on, we have the Flantastic 7. 7 heartless reminiscent of the mushroom enemies of KH1 and KH2's Mushroom 13. Seems like a missed opportunity to not keep the mushroom theme going, but at least it is cute that there are 7 of them to the last game's 13. The Flan are unlocked one at a time upon completing each world, giving you something extra to do during the main campaign if you care to revisit. And while I had fun doing them, in particular the one that makes you play Pokemon Snap, they are more of a deviation from the style of these types of enemies in the previous games to their detriment. The majority of them have you playing minigames, with only 2 being reminiscent of the combat-oriented challenges of past games. Those enemies required strategic usage of your normal gameplay abilities, which is typically a much more rewarding kind of gameplay than stripping away your usual moveset and foisting upon you a new, simplified one for a minigame you now need to relearn. It's not playing to the game's strengths, but presumably this was done to adhere more to the general design philosophy of KH3, leaning more into gimmicks than technical core gameplay. However, to be fair, most of the mushroom enemies only appeared in the final mix versions of the games, so perhaps it's unfair to compare them one for one, since the intention seemed to be about adding additional challenges to an updated version of the game that, at the time, was likely to be your second playthrough, while these appear in the base KH3. You tell me if that's better or worse for you. Speaking of the Flan, clearing all of them is one of the requirements necessary for unlocking the Ultima weapon, the strongest Keyblade in each mainline game, and the most challenging synthesis item to complete, meaning it is typically one of the last things players will do in the base game. I've always loved the process of assembling the pieces necessary to forge this Keyblade, as it typically forces you to explore those aspects of the game you might have ignored by hiding the necessary synthesis materials as rewards for mastering them. The recipe for it is unlocked when you collect 58 different synth materials, which is already already likely to have you exploring the worlds, hunting down elusive Heartless, Nobodies, and whatnot for rare drops, but it's the collection of the 7 Orichalcum Pluses that's the real hurdle. In addition to the one acquired from completing the 7 Flan challenges, the other 6 are acquired by finding 80 of the 90 lucky emblems, defeating the high-level Omega Gummy Ship boss, finding the 2 treasure chests in the Caribbean and final world, completing the delightful Frozen Slider minigame, and repeatedly reloading your save file until you randomly get one in the Twilight Town Moogle Postcard Gacha Poll. This is a fine set of endgame content to explore, and in particular, the Lucky Emblem Hunt, which also gives you the Oathkeeper Keyblade when you 100% it, was quite enjoyable, having you hunt for those elusive Mickey Mouse symbols in all kinds of unexpected places in the environment throughout levels, often visible only from certain perspectives, that help you form more of an attachment to these worlds, as the environments feel like they have more thought and meaning put into them for you, the player. They are somewhat reminiscent of the puzzle piece hunt from KH2FM, though in that game it was more about acquiring abilities that enhance your movement and allow you to reach them, as opposed to the kind of scavenger hunt we have in this game, so pick your poison. Once you have the Ultima weapon, there is one final quest you can undertake, that being to power your Keyblades up to the max level at the Keyblade Forge. I've only done this for Keyblades I regularly use, because this requires collecting a great deal of synthesis materials, in particular several that are Keyblade upgrade specific and are hard to come by, namely Fluorite, Damascus, Adamantite, and Electrum. In order to get a significant number of these, you will need to spend a large amount of time in your gummy ship blowing up asteroids in the various areas in space, as these are the only places to farm them, and there are few of the high-level materials available in any other way. So if you don't want to spend hours of your time mindlessly shooting rocks in space to take advantage of the generous 1% drop rate of Electrum, my advice is to choose wisely with what you upgrade. As for completionists, my condolences for your lost time. And for our final piece of endgame content, there is the Dark Inferno Superboss. Accessed from the 14th Battlegate, this is a souped-up, one-on-one Heartless battle, giving the player a real challenge in the form of a boss with a massive pool of health, a fast, aggressive moveset, unblockable attacks, counter moves to punish reckless attacking, and a variety of attacks that shoot out waves of damage while making them invulnerable that evolve over the course of the fight. This forces the player to learn their opponent's moves thoroughly, develop specific countermeasures to block or avoid them, and to find opportunities to get in attacks themselves. It's a boss that is challenging enough that, really for the first time in the game, players are required to take their time and study the battle carefully, and dig into the mechanics in order to win. For some of us, this is what the whole game has been building to. In short, it's a very fun boss. Definitely the best in the base game. But really, it's just a simpler taste of what's to come in the DLC. And speaking of which, it's time to talk about it. January 23rd, 2020, the Kingdom Hearts 3 Remind DLC released for $30 American dollary dues. But for only $40, you can get that, plus a recording of the Kingdom Hearts Orchestra World of Trace Osaka performance. No. Now quickly, before we get into the meat of things, let's take a moment to reflect on what is still unfortunately missing from the game, including from the DLC, despite what many of us hope for. First is the Colosseum. This was a beloved feature in Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2 that gave players the ability to test their skills fighting a number of opponents in a row, including those that were otherwise allies in the games, in particular the Final Fantasy characters. Now, since this game has far less in the way of those kinds of combat allies, it's not surprising that the Colosseum did not return, but it is a shame. We do have the battle gates in KH3, but again, those lack anything besides generic heartless mobs to battle, so they're a bit lackluster. The disappearance of those characters, of course, extends to the glaring absence of a Sephiroth boss fight, a beloved staple of the core games, which is particularly noteworthy because of Sephiroth's deep connection to Kingdom Hearts, as his character and moveset in his own games has been somewhat shaped by his appearances in Kingdom Hearts, something we'll talk about more in a future video. So his inclusion would have made a lot of sense to make a priority, but I guess just go play the Final Fantasy VII Remake instead, where you can fight Sephiroth, because that game is basically Kingdom Hearts bullshit now anyway. Now, beyond missing my man Sephi, many of us were even more unhappy to see the total absence of Final Fantasy characters from the initial version of this Disney Final Fantasy crossover game, despite the fact that they have long since evolved beyond being Final Fantasy cameos into full-fledged Kingdom Hearts versions of themselves, with new backstories and personalities directly tied into Sora's adventures. characters, and to treat them otherwise is like saying that Donald and Goofy are just Disney cameo characters. Obviously retarded. Looking back at Nomura's various comments on the situation, he claims that there was no need to include them, as the plot didn't necessitate visiting them in Radiant Garden, and that there was enough original content in the series now that they weren't needed to buoy the plot. But I, for one, haven't forgotten his earlier comments about feeling that he has outgrown the need for them, which shows me he doesn't think of them as important Kingdom Hearts characters worth checking in on, despite their previous roles. I suppose I can sympathize with some of his points, since it's true that all in all this game is bursting with original Kingdom Hearts characters from all over the series, and to avoid having to develop the models, prepare the scenario, and record dialogue for the FF gang will ease the development burden somewhat. But as is generally the case with this game, the problem really comes from the giant 20-hour chunk of Disney worlds that many of us didn't particularly care for. Adding in Radiant Garden as a world and letting us pal around with the Final Fantasy crowd for a while, like in the other games, would have been a welcome change of pace. Maybe something plot relevant could have happened then, instead of all at the end of the game. No, Nate, stop. You can't change it. Gotta let it go. In any case, it was nice to see them back, even in the small roles they got in the DLC, but we'll talk more about them later. Now let's pull up our old feature list and see what this DLC has for us. Let's start with the best one. That's right, I'm talking data greeting! Oh yeah, baby! It's the new photo mode, letting you pose basically all the characters for epic selfie moments. I can already feel the Reddit karma pouring in. And the slideshow feature lets you take your photos and make epic slideshows. Riveting. Posing the characters is kind of fun, so whatever, pretty harmless. I'm sure there's going to be people who do some creative stuff with it, so Godspeed, gents. Moving on, as you can see, the DLC proper is split into 3 episodes. We will be going through them one at a time, and first up is Remind. So, what Remind turns out to be is the story of what happened to Sora after he went to find Kairi when she vanished at the end of the game, up until we see her somehow restored as Sora vanishes to an unknown fate, seemingly ending up in the secret movie In the World Ends With You, Shibuya. Now, a quick refresher on the end of the game. We had previously seen what turns out to be Sora using the power of waking to go back in time and reset the deaths of all his friends leading up to the final battle, basically getting a do-over. But first stopping by the edge of death to enlist the help of Naminé and through her, Terra's lingering will. By the way, they were smart enough to update the Naminé star scene to be mandatory now, because without it, you won't have any idea why LW suddenly shows up during the second round, although even with it, it still doesn't make much sense why things go differently after Sora travels back, but I guess time is convoluted in the final world, so whatever. And for the record, I know Dream Drop Distance made time travel cool and established all these rules that KH3 immediately gets around, but didn't we do the whole time travel thing once before? How does that jive with, what's the connection? Oh Jesus, I don't know. From there, Sora and the gang proceed to beat the piss out of every organization boy and take down Master Xehanort once and for all, with Sora going off to save Kairi, blah blah blah. So the thing about the Remind episode is that it has you replaying through a recontextualized version of the ending scenario over again, adding in a few scenes to fix up things it didn't do right the first time, with a few additional fights, gameplay segments, and even playable characters. But above all, it definitely lives up to its name, because it certainly reminds you what a slog it was getting through this ending in the first place. But I'm getting ahead of myself. After a scene added to set up for the epic Xigbar Lucio reveal, and one sending Sora off on his time travel quest, the episode continues with a flashback to young Xehanort, who, it's revealed, has been guided since he was a young boy by the Master of Masters himself. How is he here from the Age of Antiquity? Who knows? Play the mobile game to find out. The scene gives a bit of new information, but is primarily trying to do 2 things. Flesh out Xehanort's motivation as to why he did all the big evil stuff he did, and set up the MOM as the man pulling all the strings and the real villain behind the series, because, to quote Nomura, nothing says narrative relevance like mobile game original characters. But let's take a pause and focus on that first point, fleshing out Xehanort's motivation. This will be a reoccurring theme as we talk about the events to come, but seriously, why wasn't this in the base game? I don't even think it did an amazing job explaining Xehanort's actions, but at least there was more of an attempt, since this has famously been unclear for the entire series, with KH3 only having a few parting words about how Xehanort felt only he had the strength of will, and therefore responsibility to impose order on a chaotic, self-destructive world, with this new scene showing how his experiences traveling led him to that conclusion, which having is a definite improvement. To be clear, I am not saying that Xehanort's relationship with the MOM MOM itself needed to have been fleshed out sooner. Just Xehanort's motivations as a character, the distinction being that only the latter is directly relevant to the base game of Kingdom Hearts 3, not set up for future events and games. The stories of Kingdom Hearts 1, 2, and to a lesser extent because it was a prequel, Birth by Sleep, stood on their own, then later released final mix versions that added bonus content to continue the story and hint at events to come, a feature I've always enjoyed about the series. But these features were not necessary to have a basic understanding of the events and characters within the games. That is not true of Kingdom Hearts 3, which gives more of the feeling of paying extra money for DLC that, while having plenty of new content, also contains the final pieces of the original story we did not have before. I won't do it again. And it makes Nomura's argument about the DLC being a purely separate entity from the base game that you totally don't need to play fall flat. I don't know about you, but I find it very hard to forgive a game that charges me more because it couldn't finish the job the first time. Again, I understand that the general plot of Sora's quest to save Kairi is new content, but since it is used to flesh out undercooked and unexplained parts of the original story, let's not pretend we don't see what it's doing. Anyway, from that flashback, we cut to old man Xehanort reminiscing about the MOM and his cryptic bullshit, then meeting with his boys in a scene mercifully added to explain more of the nature of the new organization. Who is really here, who became a nobody again, who is a time travel heart-based replica entity, and so on. However, even with the second try here, there are still issues not covered sufficiently to make sense. The first of which being, how are both Xehanort and Terranort restored when they're supposed to be the same guy, so you'd think only one or the other would come back? Well, in combination with fan translations of the KH3 Ultimania guide, it's clarified that apparently Old Man Xehanort and Terra were restored separately. But, for unspecified reasons, Terra didn't get his heart back, which is still hanging out inside the person behind you heartless thing. So, with an empty Terra vessel, Xehanort pulls his heart from the past when Terranort first formed to the present and into this body, creating a fresh Terranort. The positive here is that this does kind of explain why Terranort is restored, not the apprentice Xehanort Ansem form, and it does give continuity to Terra's heart specifically without weird time travel clone logic. But obviously the bulk of this is stupid bullshit built upon year after year of terrible writing. Next, we're given more information about the baffling restoration of Xion. Let's see if this one makes more sense. I'm not even going to get into why Xion was chosen as a vessel for the new 13. Something about a connection to Sora, who already has a convoluted reason to be a vessel, but being a perfect controllable blank slate, she's apparently here because they recreated her using Vexen and young Xehanort's research and experiments. I remind you, Demyx and Vexen are available as vessels for no additional effort, so why even do this? We know the answer, so our QT Goth GF can come back. So in 358, Xion, who was an empty replica vessel filled with Sora and Roxas's powers and memories, died at the end and was completely forgotten by everyone. The fact that there are records of her existence that you could use to recreate her makes sense, but really makes you feel stupid to have taken the whole wiped from existence meme they were pushing then seriously. A lot of that going around. I could talk all the day about how the Kingdom Hearts games have poured endless amounts of shit writing on top of what was once good, as well as straight up rewriting it, but let's try to stay on topic. Xehanort makes a point in this scene about how only rejoined original bodies can actually be destroyed, not heartless and nobodies, which is one of the reasons he split himself to begin with. Which, by the way, is yet another retcon, but at this point, who's still counting? Point is, all of that leads up to this. Again, with the Ultimania, it's clarified that the old research and experiments have been used to create a new Xion. And while it's a little vague, the idea seems to be that, using the old research to remember her, the heart of this creature is that of past Xion right when she first joined the organization, placed into a normal replica, the same as it is with Terranort, Riku Replica, and the other time-traveled members, so we can only infer that's how it is with Xion as well. I clarify this because it was very unclear as to whether this being is a time-traveled heart or a fresh build of Xion, who was a construct originally, with the former seeming to be the case. So I hope I've cleared that up for you. So now we've explained how this new past Xion exists, but how does she come back to us? Well, there is discussion in the game about how 3 distinct hearts are sleeping away inside Sora. 2 of which are obviously Roxas and Ventus, with the third definitely being Xion. Later, when they face off, her future heart inside Sora resonates with her past heart. And in a wonderful moment of narrative convenience, they somehow merge, restoring all the memories and making Xion a real boy. Cool. As to her heart being inside Sora, while the other two make sense, how Xion got there is extremely unclear. But perhaps with all this logic of how incomplete entities never really die, and the previous Chain of Memories lore where memories never really vanish, they are just broken apart with the pieces remaining in place, there is a tortured pathway to kind of seeing how Xion's heart could sort of still exist. And once that's established, I suppose it's consistent with how we show Riku Replica's heart sleeping away inside Riku in Kingdom Hearts 3, with Xion herself being a memory golem replica thing. So it all checks out. Obviously, this is a total mess of poorly thought out plot threads mashed together in the hopes that they'll be able to carry this clusterfuck of a story. While you can technically follow what is happening, let's not ignore what an incredible get out of jail free card this cop-out time travel bullshit has been, which arguably shouldn't be considered saving anyone at all. This is what writing when backed into a corner looks like. And going by what we've learned here, I don't see any reason why we couldn't use time travel to save everyone everywhere from the moment of death and put them in a replica body. We've discovered the secret to immortality. Let's heckin' go! Oh, we're not going to talk about that? We're just going to move on? Okay. Now, at last, let's talk about what Sora's getting up to here. So, from the final world, Sora is instructed by Chirithy to be careful with the power of waking, because even though it can, it apparently isn't supposed to be used to rewrite history the way he has been, and it could kill him. When Sora did this before, it basically created a dragon break, or tear in the fabric of time where multiple histories exist, and the goal is to start from there, replay events traveling from heart to heart, and find Kairi in there somewhere. I guess the idea is to locate the remnants of Kairi's heart from along the timeline and only change her fate, so the timeline isn't messed with too much. Chirithy actually makes it clear it is absolutely impossible to change history with the method they will be using in any way other than saving Kairi. So won't that be convenient for avoiding having to change our old cutscenes? But seriously, I suspect that the DLC was at least partially designed this way so that players can replay the events of the endgame if they care to, without worrying about managing save files. So if that's you, aren't you lucky? Quickly running through the scenarios. You are first put into Ventus's heart, where we fight a reskinned, dumbed-down Dark Inferno, then into Aqua for an anti-Aqua rematch. Then here's where we get some new cutscene content, with them really spelling out that it was Naminé who brought out the lingering will to fight Terranort. From inside Terra, we get a new one-on-one fight with Terranort. Personally, I was quite disappointed we don't get to play as Lingering Will like in Birth by Sleep, but what can you do? From this point, it's time to rebattle all our grouped up organization members in 4 big battles with a few new cutscenes here and there, some of which makes Kairi seem like an almost respectable party member, but more importantly, clarifying about Xion and Roxas. We already spoke about Xion, but regarding Roxas, as I've said before, while I find it regrettable his story arc from KH2 has been so thoroughly trampled, the damage is long since done, and his return at least makes sense given the new story mechanics. His heart having just been inside Sora, and now coming to inhabit a replica, with his return at least not involving time travel, and the new scenes change nothing about that. We do, however, get an essential missing piece at last: the ability to play as Roxas. It's been a long time, and only for one fight, but KH2 Chads, we're finally home. Like all the non-Sora playable characters, his moveset is significantly limited, but it's certainly fun to finally be back behind the wheel of him, even if the event is a tad gimmicky. This is rather similar to the glaring omission of a Roxas boss fight in the original KH2, a boneheaded oversight from the start, thankfully corrected in Final Mix. He's Sora with an edgier, hot topic twist, and the best boy, so it's nice to see him back in the spotlight. Sora hops around a bit more until arriving back at Kairi's unfortunate incident and using the portal created in Master Xehanort to travel to Scala Ad Caelum. And really, to me, this is where the DLC finally gets fun. While this world existed in the base game, you didn't have a chance to really explore it until now, having been expanded substantially, with the mission to collect Kairi's heart petals giving a much-needed break from the endless, tedious cutscenes. I'd go so far as to say that this is the single best world in terms of gameplay in all of Kingdom Hearts 3, because it just lets you think, explore, and fight uninterrupted at your own pace while hunting for the MacGuffin, with some very clever level design to boot. As the sequence concludes, with Sora still on the hunt for 2 more shards, we cut away to events happening outside Kingdom Hearts for a new series of battles. Considering how explicit Chirithy was about the past not being able to change as future Sora travels, the implication seems to be that these events always took place. We're just seeing them here for the first time. First of which is the appearance of the Xehanort goat clones at a big gimmick fight against all our secondaries in the clouds. The fight is simplistic mechanically, but there's some nice banter between our reunited heroes, referencing their powers and old connections in attack names and reaction commands, with Big Dick Terra styling 2-on-1 like an absolute mad lad. I wonder if Nomura felt awkward about these characters doing nothing while Sora beats the big bad, and added these so they haven't been just standing there, which really just reflects poorly on the decision to do so in the first place. But hey, they're cute filler, so who cares? After this fight, our characters get scattered, and we get Mickey's Doom Guy moment, going 13-on-1 and being too angry to die. Again, not very interesting mechanically, but fun to experience. Through Mickey and Future Sora's efforts, our characters are rescued, Sora obtains the last pedal he needs, and Kairi is restored. And at last, after hours of repetitive bullshit and gimmick fights, we are finally given a fitting reward. A new final boss to overcome, and a new playable character to do it with. Yes, after the first hints of it in KH2, Kairi finally becomes a playable character using Aqua's old Keyblade. It's a fine fight, similar to other Master Xehanort forms, with moves that show off Sora and Kairi's connection. It's a nice reward after everything. After this, our time travel is wrapped up, with Sora and Kairi reappearing in the final world to bring Charity with them back to their friends, but with Sora barely hanging in there due to overuse of the power of waking. Guess Charity's advice didn't do much, huh? As the ending rolls, we see Kairi and Sora watching over their buddies as we re-reach our ending point with Sora fading away. It's very Simone and Nia, with the roles reversed. Cue our 2 secret movies, with Xigbar Lucio in the box, and the otherworldly trip of Sora and Riku to visit Yozora and the MOM in Shibuya. And that does it for Remind. All in all, a mixed bag of reused assets, exposition that should have always been there, and a fair bit of fun new content. If it was just this, I would say it's not worth $30, but we're just getting started. Or maybe not, because this is the end of the video. Yes, this video is already too long and is only half the script. So for the rest of the Kingdom Hearts 3 complete review, you will have to tune in for part 2 coming soon, where we'll talk about the Limit Cut episode, Secret episode, and future of the series. And I do mean soon, not like some other projects I've got going, so don't go too far. Hope you'll stick around, because I think we both know the good stuff is still to come. As you can see, I'm going in depth here, folks, so bear with me as I dig into it. Thanks to everybody supporting this channel, maybe consider becoming one of them, and see you soon.